They were the two greatest drivers of their generation. One was cold, calculating, and brilliant. They called him the Professor. The other was intense, spiritual, and impossibly fast, a man who seemed to drive on the very edge of the possible. For 5 explosive years, Alain Prost and Ayrton Senna waged the most bitter, most personal war in the history of Formula One. They were teammates who became enemies. They collided at over 200 kilometers an hour to win championships. They hated each other. And then, just as the world thought it understood them, their story ended in tragedy and in an act of reconciliation that almost no one saw coming. This is the story of Senna versus Prost. To understand the war, you first have to understand the two men. Alain Prost arrived first. A Frenchman of extraordinary intelligence, he didn't drive a car so much as solve it. Smooth, economical, never using more of the machine than he needed. He thought a race through like a chess match, conserving his tires and his engine while rivals burned themselves out. They nicknamed him the Professor, and by the mid-1980s he was already a world champion. Then came Ayrton Senna. A Brazilian from São Paulo, Senna was something the sport had rarely seen, a driver of almost frightening commitment, who believed his talent was a gift from God. In the rain, in qualifying, on a single perfect lap, he was untouchable. Where Prost was calculation, Senna was raw emotion and faith, two completely opposite philosophies of speed. It was only a matter of time before they collided. In 1988, the two were brought together at McLaren, the most powerful team in Formula One, armed with the dominant Honda engine. On paper, it was a dream partnership. In reality, it was a bomb with a lit fuse. That season, the red and white McLarens were simply untouchable, winning 15 of the 16 races. But the real battle wasn't with the rest of the grid. It was between the two men in the same garage. Every weekend became a private duel. Senna, desperate to prove himself against the established champion, drove with a ferocity that unsettled even Prost. At the season's end, it was Senna who took his first world title. But something had shifted. Prost felt his younger teammate would stop at nothing, and Senna believed Prost was using politics to turn the team against him. The trust was already gone. The relationship curdled into open suspicion. These were two men who could not have been more different in how they saw the very act of racing. For Prost, there were lines you did not cross, unspoken codes between professionals. For Senna, the only thing that mattered was the gap ahead and the will to take it. He famously said that if you no longer go for a gap that exists, you are no longer a racing driver. To Prost, that wasn't bravery. It was madness. A man willing to crash rather than lose. Inside McLaren, the team split in two, with engineers and mechanics taking sides. The garage that housed the two best drivers in the world had become a battlefield. And in 1989, the Cold War finally turned hot. It began with a broken promise. Before the San Marino Grand Prix, the two teammates had reportedly made a gentleman's agreement. Whoever reached the first corner in front would not be challenged into it. When the race was restarted after a frightening crash, it was Prost who led away. But Senna swept past him at that very first corner, breaking the pact. To Prost, it was a betrayal. Plain and simple. His teammate had given his word and broken it. Senna, for his part, felt no guilt at all. The two men stopped speaking. What had been a sporting rivalry was now bitterly, deeply personal. And the championship that year would be decided not by speed alone, but by a single infamous moment of contact. The title came down to the penultimate race in Japan at the Suzuka circuit. Prost led. Senna had to win to keep his hopes alive. For lap after lap, Senna hunted him down, until finally he dived for the inside at a slow chicane. Prost, for once, refused to yield and turned in. The two McLarens locked together and slid to a halt, wheels interlocked. Prost climbed out, his championship seemingly secured. But Senna, incredibly, kept going. He was push-started by the marshals, pitted for a new nose, and stormed back to cross the line first. For a moment, he had won. And then came the hammer blow. The officials disqualified him, ruling that he had missed the chicane. The title went to Prost. Senna was convinced he had been robbed by the sport's politics, and his rage would burn for an entire year. For 1990, Prost did the unthinkable. He left McLaren and joined Ferrari, the most romantic name in all of motorsport. The rivalry now had everything: two enemies, two great teams, and a nation's worth of expectation on each side. And once again, the championship marched towards a showdown in Japan, at the very same Suzuka circuit where it had exploded a year before. Senna took pole position, but he was furious that pole was on the dirty side of the track, handing Prost a likely advantage into the first corner. Senna warned in private that if Prost beat him off the line, he would not be backing out. He had not forgotten 1989, he had not forgiven it, and he intended to settle the score his own way. When the lights went out, Prost got the better start and edged ahead. They reached the first corner side by side at nearly 270 kilometers an hour. Senna did not lift. He drove straight into the back of Prost's Ferrari, and both cars speared off the track into the gravel in a cloud of dust. It was over in an instant. Neither man was hurt. But with Prost out of the race, the world championship was Senna's. It was one of the most shocking moments the sport had ever witnessed. A year later, Senna would finally admit the truth. The crash had been deliberate. He had decided coldly that if he was wronged, he would take what he believed was rightfully his. The rivalry had reached its darkest point. And yet, this is where the story turns. As the years passed, the fury slowly began to cool. Prost won a fourth and final world title in 1993 and then announced his retirement. At his very last race in Australia, an extraordinary thing happened. Senna, who had fought him so viciously for so long, pulled the retiring Prost up onto the top step of the podium and embraced him. The two old enemies stood together, smiling. The war finally over. In private, Senna had even begun reaching out to Prost over the radio, welcoming his old rival warmly. The hatred that had defined a generation was, at last, melting into something that looked almost like friendship. Tragically, there was very little time left. On the 1st of May 1994, at the San Marino Grand Prix at Imola, Ayrton Senna was leading the race when his car left the track at high speed and struck a concrete wall. He died that day. The world was plunged into grief, and no one was struck harder than Alain Prost. The man who had been his fiercest enemy was utterly devastated. It emerged that in his final months, Senna had spoken of Prost with real warmth, even mentioning him on the radio during a race weekend, as if reaching across the years to close the wound between them. Prost helped carry his rival's coffin. He later said that a part of himself had died with Senna, that their lives had been so entwined through rivalry that he felt strangely incomplete without him. The enemy had become, in the end, something far deeper. Senna versus Prost was never really about two cars. It was about two opposite ways of being: calculation against faith, the head against the heart, pushed to the absolute limit by men who made each other greater. They dragged the very best and the very worst out of one another, and in doing so, they defined an entire era of Formula One. Decades later, their duel remains the benchmark against which every great sporting rivalry is measured. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Automotive Stories for more legends from the world of cars, and tell me in the comments, in the war between the head and the heart, whose side are you on? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.